Hello friends and welcome back. So I just finished watching what I guess was either the series or season finale of WandaVision on Disney+. And I have some general thoughts that I would like to share. Not so much about the actual content of the show. This is not going to be a video where I talk about Easter eggs or how things compared to the original comics, because frankly, my knowledge on the subject just really doesn't go that deep. I am a person who grew up really liking Marvel Comics when I was much younger, and I am a person who is generally an enjoyer of the MCU, if not an outright fan. As you can tell from the title of this video, I obviously have some serious issues with WandaVision, but I'm going to start off this video with a pretty major caveat, which is to say that I actually really enjoyed the show. I thought the process of watching WandaVision was fun and at times emotionally engaging. And as far as it relates to the larger MCU, I think that they actually really did do some interesting things, both tonally and stylistically. But the thing that I keep finding myself coming back to over and over again when I watch WandaVision and when I watch really any Marvel property is there's always something that I'm kind of bumping up against. And I thought it might be helpful if I broke down the reasons that I believe WandaVision failed to be anything more than just a very entertaining piece of pulp fiction that winked at some interesting ideas without ever actually fully diving into those ideas. Before I go too much further into this, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. While you do that, I'll take a sip of my Corona, the favorite drink of the main guy from a far superior franchise, which would be Dominic Toretto from the Fast and the Furious films. Salud, mi familia. Issue number one. We did not learn anything about Wanda that we didn't already know prior to the TV show. Yes, we did obviously learn that Wanda was really into TV shows with her family. We learned that those old sitcoms were a source of comfort for her. We learned, I guess, more stuff about her being the Scarlet Witch or whatever, and that's all well and good. But emotionally, the show began with a character where, frankly, at least as far as it relates to the larger MCU, there really wasn't a whole lot of there. It's not to say that she's like the worst character in the world, just that there's not much to her that is really all that definable outside of the fact that she's really angry and she's sad and she's very powerful. If you were to try and think of the adjectives to describe Wanda, how would you describe her? I was talking to some people about the show and mentioned at one point that I had never actually seen Avengers Age of Ultron, and people were like, oh, well then you gotta see Age of Ultron because it explains so much. And I watched it, and really all it did was make me feel that A, they didn't really have a whole bunch of great ideas for the character to begin with, and also the whole episode where they had kind of the flashbacks where they show her from the point where she's a little girl to when she volunteers for the experiments, and where she sees Tony Stark's name on the side of the bomb or whatever. Like, all those things are things that they had just kind of told us in the previous movie, and I guess they showed us this time. But like, seriously, what is it that we now know about her, or that we've learned about her as a person that we didn't previously know? Number two, the MCU's strengths are also the MCU's weaknesses. In general, I kind of feel like with the MCU, there are sort of a number of different ways to enjoy it. Obviously, there is the like extreme comic book fandom, people who, have been, reading all the back issues of whatever and, enjoy all the Easter eggs and the tie-ins and the things like that. And then there's also just kind of enough plain old entertainment for the casual viewer. In order to be able to satisfy both of these people, the entire MCU is really just kind of like a staggering feat of exceptional whiteboard planning. And by that, I just mean like you have all the note cards with like the 8 million different little details that you need to keep track of, and you have it all up on the whiteboard, and it's sort of like, oh, okay, well, we're going to mention this in this movie, and that's going to tie into this movie and stuff like that, yada, yada. The actual balancing act that they do is incredible, but And I think you can kind of see it here in Wanda with the fact that where her story begins and then kind of ends in this, you could miss the entire series and just kind of pick up with the next Avengers movie or whatever. And as far as you were concerned, like the only thing that would actually be different about where you last left her in the last Avengers movie and when you see her in the next thing is like her costume is changed. Everything within the MCU is kind of a really stunning technical achievement and a really stunning business achievement, especially when you compare it to what's happening with Star Wars right now, where all of the attempts to do the prequels and then the sequels that came after it, the problem that Star Wars seemed to be running into was that it was always kind of serving the master of that original core trilogy. And the MCU doesn't have that problem. The MCU is basically just saying, oh, we're just going to be a kind of a huge boulder that's ever rolling forward. And as a result, everything within the MCU has like a great deal of kinetic energy, like a bunch of, kind of moving everything forward. But that same thing and the need for them to be able to have a movie that doesn't actually matter that much, or in this case now a show that doesn't actually matter that much to the casual fan, nothing can ever really seem to change that much. And so it's always kind of coming up against like this feeling of, you can take the toy off the shelf and play with it, but don't break it no matter what. Like, it's sort of like do your thing with it and then return it. And in many ways, I understand that is just kind of what comic books are, right? Like, the whole idea with comics is that things are just always changing, always moving forward. Obviously, you'll have like, like little side issues here or there or whatever. But the main idea is that it's like, you need to be able to keep all these balls in the air because you never know when you're going to want to be able to grab them again. But with that in mind, that is the same thing that ultimately makes a show like this emotionally muted. Like even when they're playing with a certain emotion, you can only ever get so much out of it because as a fan, you kind of know that only so much can happen. People, got really upset a few years ago when Martin Scorsese, had, some offhanded comment about how he thought that the superhero movies, and it sounded like he was talking about Marvel movies in general, and he said they aren't cinema or something like that. And then he wrote a op-ed in the New York Times where he was sort of tried to clarify what he meant by that. And the general thing that he was saying is that he compared the Marvel movies to a ride in a theme park. I'm gonna read this one quote. He was talking about how when he was a kid, the closest thing that there was to a franchise like Marvel was Hitchcock movies. Really, not because they were actually part of a larger, HCU, but rather that they were that anytime a Hitchcock movie came out, it was a big event. But anyway, so let me read here. He says, "Some say that Hitchcock's pictures had a sameness to them, and perhaps that's true. Hitchcock himself wondered about it. But the sameness of today's franchise pictures is something else again. Many of the elements that define cinema as I know it are there in Marvel pictures. What's not there is revelation, mystery, or genuine emotional danger. Nothing is at risk. The pictures are made to satisfy a specific set of demands. They are designed as variations on a finite number of themes." And I would agree with this. Now, there are probably some examples of superhero movies in general that kind of break out of this a little bit. I think Dark Knight is a great movie. And in many ways, you watch that, Batman's not gonna die or anything like that, but it does actually, explore some pretty heady themes. And even though it's part of a trilogy, does kind of feel like it stands on its own as one movie. It doesn't feel like it's carrying the burden of other movies in a series, I guess. Another example would be a movie like Logan, but part of the reason that Logan was able to be so successful was the fact that it kind of intentionally separated itself from the rest of the X-Men films, and it was a true final chapter in a story, so that they could play with things and they could go to places emotionally that a lot of these other movies cannot. Part of what made Logan a much more emotionally powerful movie was the fact that Logan dies at the end of the movie. Spoiler, I guess, if you haven't seen Logan. The death of Logan brings me to the third and final thing I want to talk about, which is that a show cannot truly be about grief and loss if the loss isn't actually real. Now, this isn't specific to WandaVision. This is a thing that comes up certainly in a lot of Marvel movies where death is kind of used essentially as a launching off point for a plot within a movie, or as a reason for why a character is doing something. But the death itself is not necessarily a permanent thing. I know that comic book deaths, are that's kind of its own trope within comics, like this idea that when you die you never truly die, because ultimately a character is a valuable piece of IP, and if people enjoy seeing that character, they want to be able to bring that back. The thing that I think particularly drove me nuts about WandaVision was the fact that I see a lot of people talking about it as if it has something really profound to say about grief, and it really doesn't. Is the thing. It uses grief as a way to give justification to what Wanda is doing. And maybe you can, if you really feel like sort of diving into it, like you can talk about this idea of like, oh, grief makes you do crazy things or whatever, but it's not truly about the experience of somebody losing a person. It's not truly about dealing with death. There was a really great AV Club article that came out a few years ago. I'm going to link to it down below, called Fake Deaths, Cheap Resurrections, and Dealing with Real Grief by William Hughes. I'm actually not gonna read too much from the article because it's extremely heartbreaking. In it, William talks about losing his fiance very unexpectedly in their early 20s, and sort of how that changed the way that he saw death used as a tool in movies. I myself, have dealt with my share of loss. I lost my father-in-law a few years ago. I lost my dad when I was 17 years old. And it's not to say that when I see a movie like or a show like WandaVision or whatever, that it fills me with rage, when a character dies, like a Groot, for example, and then is reborn or whatever. Like, because ultimately I'm watching these things as a fan and as a person who's like, yeah, of course I want to see a character come back if I like the character. But in order for a show to try and pitch itself as being about something that is so specific and so painful and so permanent, it kind of drives me crazy to have it where you basically have a character who was dead, who has basically at this point been resurrected now twice within the show. It's sort of like pick your poison. He came back both as kind of a extension, I guess, of her own memory, where he was kind of this sentient being within her fantasy world. And then there was kind of like the new rebuilt body of Vision that arrives, where as far as we know, when he flies off, he has all the memories of the other Vision. And so for all intents and purposes, the person who was kind of the whole engine behind the grief that Wanda was feeling to actually, have this entire series isn't even dead. Like he's not even actually gone. So what are we doing? We see WandaVision, essentially creates these children that had never previously existed. And then there's this moment where she parts with them, and it's very emotionally affecting. But then the very end, at the end credits or whatever, we get another thing where you just kind of hear their voices. So it's like, okay, they're going to be in the multiverse of madness or whatever, these people that she just kind of manifested. And then, so they're not gone either. They essentially want the ability to do the emotional manipulation that comes with it, with death, without actually needing to commit to what it means for someone or something to be dead. Now, I understand if you're hearing me talk about this stuff and your thought is, Jake, it's just a comic book show. It just you're taking it too seriously, and I understand that. But if that is how we are going to approach the stuff in the MCU, if that is how we are going to approach comic book movies in general, then we are basically starting from a place of, we know it's not high art. We know it is a less than art form, because ultimately it's just kind of exactly what Martin Scorsese said it was, right? You know, it's a ride. It's a technical feat, but it is so limited to these very specific parameters of how far you can go. And I don't know. I just don't know how interested I am in that long term. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments, questions, anything like that, leave it down below. I'd love to talk with you guys more about it. If you haven't already, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. I put out a new video every single Wednesday. I'm having a good time. I hope you guys are having a good time too. We try to keep things light and fun here at this channel. Thanks so much, guys. Talk soon.